Today we talk about the Polish-Bolshevik War. We will actually make multiple videos about this. This is just a broader introduction to the war. One special video, of course, is owed to the Battle of Warsaw, 1920. Today, again, we look at the complex singularly. So, in the setting here, the armistice, that concluded World War I in November 1918 left essentially the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe to contend over the ruins of two shattered, or if not three shattered empires, as a matter of fact. So after centuries under domination of the Austrian Habsburgs and the Russian Romanovs, the Polish, the Lithuanian, and the Ukrainian peoples suddenly found themselves free, or at least to fight, have the possibility of fighting for their own independence. And the region of the war known as the marshlands, right, broadly meant here in the areas that we are seeing even this major conflict is taking place currently, had a history, of course, of ill-defined national borders, but also of martial valor and tradition that made such wars inevitable. And the type, of course, of aggressive expansionistic policy carried out by the communists, the Bolsheviks at this point, essentially emerging victorious from the Civil War, with the Red Army further, let's say, pressing on these peoples, would trigger an important military reaction. And it's too easy, let's say, to give this background, but comprehensively can be read in this way. We'll see better how, because already much before the armistice, and for more than a year thereafter, the situation was really chaotic. Right, the marshlands were at this point animated by communists, reactionaries, simple bandits, vigilante militias, also self-styled patriots of any kind that would essentially fight one another at all times. And this situation was extremely complicated, even just from a political point of view, and consequently from a strategic one, because battles basically streamed intermittently everywhere due to this. And as 1919 was ending, there were, however, some better defined authorities gradually emerging from this chaos. So as we were saying, Lenin and Trotsky's Red Army had secured at this point an unbreakable hold on power in Russia, particularly on the most the most important centers, of course, Moscow and Leningrad already, so St. Petersburg. That were the areas, of course, of the industries, the areas of power. At this point, actually, the Bolsheviks were facing massive peasant rebellions, especially in the east, right? Meanwhile, Poland achieved this, its long-cherished dream of nationhood. After that, essentially only a bit more than 100 years before, and that's, this was just even 100 years ago in perspective, it's not really that far away. Its country had been essentially and famously partitioned between essentially the 70s and the 90s of the 18th century, between the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians, and mostly at that time Catherine the Great, and so the Tsars controlling the majority of Poland fundamentally. And so, of course, bear in mind that the modern Polish boundaries are much more shifted towards the west than it was historical Poland, right? That encompassed some areas were ethnically mixed, and would have been today's, in fact, Belarus, even Lithuania partly, and Ukraine. Now, This after World War I, this new nation was born. I don't know if you ever read Bulgakov's the White Guard, but it's quite interesting because it tells a bit the story there in Kiev. Whereas there is Poland. What is Poland? It was a new country that never heard of, at least there, at least then. That's the simplified version of the story, but it's not quite the case. Also because Poland had a dramatic history of national history before the partitions, and continued, of course, having that, and these events would prove it. So, in fact, it's fair to say that of all the countries in the marshlands, Poland was the one that had the greatest moral force struggling towards freedom per se, at least in a more coherent, defined, and kind of ideologically framed fashion. And surely it was the country that had been, in a sense, lucky, paradoxically, because it had had the opportunity to do the most to earn that freedom up to that point. Because during World War I, and military experience in this sense was crucial, a great deal of Polish patriots and quite brilliant human beings, in many ways, had served both the Russians and the Austrians, essentially, and had thus acquired a certain capacity also that would be put at the service of the resurrection of their country. The sudden collapse of these states, also the abdication of the German Kaiser, provided these Poles an partly unexpected but also unprecedented opportunity to attain their national goal. And so this was, again, experience, political, military one, and a big deal of connection that the Poles had with the rest of the world that would prove important during the war, as we will see now. So the Polish nationalists formed the Sejm, so the Polish Parliament. That was historically, the Polish name of the Parliament that had existed in the Kingdom of Poland within also the Confederacy of Lithuania. And the titular head of the government and also commander-in-chief of the armed forces was the famed Marshal Józef Pilsudski, who was a bold and violently popular Polish patriot, and who is essentially the protagonist of the war on the Polish side. At this point in history, Poland could not peacefully coexist with Soviet Russia. Right? The Soviet Union did not exist yet. That would occur 3 years later. At this point, however, it was still, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, basically the same thing. And the Bolsheviks of these years in 1920 were still quite believing in the imminence of a global communist revolution. And Poland, in their view, was considered as essentially the perfect conduit through which they could spread radical communist insurgency, especially to Germany, because at this point the Soviets thought that Russia alone without Germany could factually not achieve even its survival, and through Germany, the spread of the Soviets all over Western Europe. And the situation, if was quite dramatic, because Germany was at this point was defeated, was exhausted. The St. Poles had grabbed some important and would keep actually grab some important parts of this. And what the communists would do at this point is that they rejected the Brest-Litovsk agreement at this point, so that they would start recovering those territories that they had essentially they had signed the armistice with Germany, so territories that had been previously part of the Second Reich and that now were essentially Poland, right? And so they had resumed with the Red Army an expansion westwards that naturally conflicted with with the idea of Poland, as we will see that also the Reds had in quite completely, you know, still Russian imperialistic fashion, that they considered Poland just as a Russian province. They didn't give it essentially a damn about even properly the idea of Polish national identity, or at least they did, in the sense of, you know, saying that they were the lords, the masters, the crooked capitalists, and so on. In fact, this is the point, that the many communists, as we were explaining also in the video about the Soviet Union, were still embracing, of course, the Russian nationalist ideology in an anti-Polish fashion. And in fact, the Bolsheviks officially at this point, they refer to the Polish independence fighters as the Polaki, that is to say, properly the White Poles, as if they had been the White Russians, right? You know, during the Civil War. Marshal Pilsudski instead had other ideas, of course, of how things would have had to do, and he was convinced in the capacity of checking the Soviet threat. He, in fact, openly declared his intention to establish friendly relations throughout all the marshlands, particularly with Ukrainians, that, albeit having essentially fought against the same Poles, because they had, you know, the Ukrainians had fought for the Russians, the Poles for the Austrians mostly. In that case, they recognized in Bolshevism a common threat to their independence, and the Ukrainians knew better, because Ukraine at this point was a mess, was fragmented basically in 4 chunks, was you know, ravaged by these crises. And Poland understood that, you know, marching on Ukraine and liberating it, and eventually marching north against the Bolsheviks, was essentially a good moment, especially at this point with the the Russian insurrections in the east and so on. And in fact, the western border of the Soviets had remained relatively unprotected, and quite important in the establishment of Polish-Ukrainian relations was in here the personal, cultivated friendship between Pilsudski and the Ukrainian hetman Simon Petlura. That was essentially the headman, at least, of independent forces in Ukraine. So on April the 22nd, 1920, Pilsudski and Petlura signed a military convention agreeing to drive the Red Army out of the region by joining forces against them. In this way, they would hope to secure independence of both nations. And 2 days after this convention, the Poles launched an attack on the Soviets. So the Bolshevik strategy on the western borders of Russia would virtually ensure a Polish triumph at that point. The Poles invaded with some of their finest, as we will see now, essentially 60,000 Poles plus 4,000 Ukrainians. Petlura could not really put together too many forces, because at this point Ukraine was still being somewhat at the mercy of Poland, that had surely some national interests on its own, also securing the older borders and controls on Ukrainian areas, but there wasn't really much that could be done otherwise at that point. And surely the greatest problem at that point in general was the Red Army, right? That, by the way, was exhausted at this point after the Civil War. In fact, the communist leadership knew this, and as Stalin would say later, at that time they were thinking essentially that while everything was for the war before, which was also pretty straining, at that point it was mostly a struggle for the economy, as you know, it had disastrously gone if anything, not just because of the war, but also because of the same Bolshevik means, let's call it in this way. However, there was a relentless struggle from the Soviet side to increase the size of their forces, right? Mostly, as always, quantity, that point over quality, and they could produce something like 50,000 rifles a month for a couple of industries that they had. Men, they had plenty, of course, as always, in Russia, and the build-up of the Soviet armed forces would, by the way, give also the same Poles one more incentive to attack in a preemptive fashion, which was a solid rationale given, to justify a unilateral strike. Still, however, with a war going on, and these pattern, of course, there was a big deal of propaganda. We see here I've added also a lot of manifestos, etc., to show more or less what was the climate in this sense. And in fact, if you even study what happened 20 years later with Operation Barbarossa, if you actually study the Soviet deployment on the western borders, you realize that they were all turned towards the offensive. Actually, they were, so even just as a preemptive strike, that was not a good decision to attack in the first place, but nobody can joke about what goes on such macroscopical evidence. In any case, just like it would happen in 1941, the Soviets were very poorly deployed. Their forces essentially hugged the borders, were huge, they were easily surrounded. In 1920, the Red Army was still concentrated in the north, though, right? So the idea was that at some point war with Poland would break out, and still there was no way to maintain the army in the field in large numbers, especially with threats coming from the within of the same Russia, and with much less properly resources to spend for maintaining an army permanently out there and deployed. And this left Ukraine severely undermanned and relatively unguarded at this point. Consider that the majority of this, Petliura, etc., they were in the west. They had escaped because at this point Kiev in 1918 was occupied still by already by the Bolsheviks, and the Reds were at this point taken by surprise. They had essentially left at least the initiative to the Poles, who were, by the way, very highly committed. Was an incredibly high morale from the Polish side. The whole thing took some kind of nationalist tone because the liberation of Ukraine, of course, seemed now like essentially just a Polish affair for what they were concerned. De Gaulle said eventually when Kiev was taken by the Poles, as we'll see, with actually great support by the local population, which had hope for the Bolsheviks, of course, to be overthrown, that the Poles had kind of lost touch with reality, as a matter of fact, while he was coming back to France. And Petliura originally offered a division for the spring campaign. However, he could put together only one infantry battalion and one regiment of cavalry. And so this actually reflected the Ukrainian awareness of the fact that, of course, he was working for the Poles, and that, of course, the Poles were better than the Bolsheviks, but let's say that this was something different than a mere, a full Ukrainian independence of some sort. Also, this would play some role in the same march of the Polish army across Ukraine later on against the same Bolsheviks, because also the countryside was something much more let's say, detach from this international policy, and just whoever crossed that bosom, would meet with some kind of hostility from the local populace of some sort. This is true both for the Russians and the Poles here. In fact, this was the degree of popular support that Petliura could enjoy. And there were not much hopes about that this campaign would bring just to an actual national liberation of Ukraine. In spite of this, Pilsudski pressed ahead with his plans. On April the 24th, 1920, the Poles swept into Ukraine. And on the first day alone, the Polish army covered 55 miles. That gives you an idea of how up they were to this. And wherever the Soviets resisted, they suffered staggering casualties. The Red Army 7th Rifle Division lost 2/5 of its strength after charging a Polish cavalry brigade with lowered bayonets, which is not really a good idea, frankly. And the Russian 44th Rifle Division suffered a more typical and less glorious fate, at least, when basically lost contact with its quarters and simply melted away. Everybody deserted. There was a Polish air bombardment of Kiev. The arms involved in this scenario are very interesting. If you want, later we can digress on this, but this was an important also display, and the Poles were quite capable here in integrating all the various arms effectively, right? Considering that they were a recent nation, they had never kind of fought on their own, right? But yet now they made very good use of aircraft, armored vehicles, cavalry, that especially in the plains of Eastern Europe played a dramatic role here. It wasn't much of trench warfare, not even that much during World War I in these areas, and cavalry, as we will see, played always a very important role, right? Not much of the classical shock power of one times, but let's say in communications, outflanking, and still, of course, even some cavalry charges, some of the most ferocious that, in fact, and effective in history, not as mounted infantry, probably as with lance and saber, right, were successfully launched by the Poles in this scenario. What happened in 1939 was already a much reduced thing. And it's fair to say, in fact, that Poland brought modern warfare to the Ukrainian steppe. The local warfare was, in fact, based on marauding in many ways. The Poles instead planned in 1920 their attacks very well, methodically, precisely. They executed them, effectively, and they essentially made it to exploit every arm potential to the effect they wished. Also, because many of them had already fought on the Eastern Front and therefore had gained skill and experience in such broader maneuvers, right? Differently from what had happened on average more in the Western Front. On May the 7th, the Polish troops entered Kiev. There was a great jubilation. They were put flowers in their rifles, right? Hoping, to kill somebody, not like the celebrated people would do, some generation later, just for being anti-war, for no reason. And after securing the Ukrainian capital, Pilsudski headed his army north, right? The objective was essentially enveloping the entire Soviet Western Front from the south, from its left, and making it crumble and essentially taking over great parts of land, especially in Belarus, in Ukraine, etc. And meanwhile, the Ukrainians began to receive an important amount of Polish equipment and supplies that would be vital for carrying out autonomously their own military activity. And in fact, they were expected to field a consistent and effective force by late May. At this point, however, it became evident that the rapid Polish advance in Soviet territory had, discounted, say, the broader, for example, logistical problems, because really these spaces involved here, we should make an entire video just on the terrain of the Polish-Bolshevik War, because they were extremely poor, right? There wasn't much the army could easily sustain itself. Of the same objectives were, very much scattered, right? There was a broader strategic problem of even, like, mostly attacks on the fronts were, the fronts were outstretched. If you wanted to attack significant objectives, that these were, 50 miles away one from the other, the various units were too far. They lacked coordination. There was, especially, this was the main problem, that the enemy always had an escape route. I mean, you had it too, but this would bring the thing to be dramatically inconclusive, really attritioning, and logistically very costly for two countries like Poland and Russia now, that, as we've seen, were already exhausted by themselves by the war, and the wars that had been fought in the previous years, and that therefore could not really afford too much luxury in this sense. And the Soviets at this point launched a counterattack on May the 25th. The Polish Air Force began sighting masses of Bolshevik cavalry. Right, this was the Konarmia, that is a 16,000 man so-called cavalry army, literally, led by a very capable, resilient peasant general, Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny, and the Konarmia crashed into the Polish southern flank on June the 5th, breaking essentially through the Polish defenses at Zhytomyr. And this brought to a massive reversal of the strategic situation, because the Poles found themselves outflanked, dangerously outflanked, with essentially communications cut from they're sent from Ukraine and from Poland, which obliged them to come back as soon as possible to the latter. So pushed by the Bolsheviks, right, that were driving them back. Bolshevik cavalry wasn't really appreciated for its quality or its order, but it was fighting in its home, right, in the steppes. So where this deeply rooted kind of semi-nomadic military fashion, because also all the ethnic elements that were fighting within it felt at home in terms especially of scorched earth strategy, of harassment of supply lines and all these things, that for an important army like the Polish one, a mechanized modern one, that literally was out there in the wasteland without significant very often adequate supplies, was essentially striking at the Schwerpunkt of the same Polish army at that point. So the Bolsheviks managed to drive back the Poles at an average of 30 miles per day. So this is full, we've seen it in commenting in the phone. As much as you can go, you go, right? Both if you are the if you're chasing, if you're being chased, right? And in the process, the Soviets massacred basically everybody that opposed to them, right? They slaughtered the survivors of Zhytomyr. They killed 600 wounded Poles at Berdychev, and the Soviets indulgence was known as grabit, that is properly the looting, right, as a personal blessing of the army commissary Leon Trotsky, that evidently, in this sense, showed his bias towards the necessity of a minimal privatization of within the communist cause, and consider the appalling misery of these communist reality. I mean, within the entire Konarmia, it's estimated only basically nobody could read, literally, and so these were fanatics who revered Marx and Lenin as some sort of supernatural beings, etc., mixing who knows what. They are even part of their sound. Them, I wouldn't be surprised if they were pagan, as a matter of fact, because considering their background, in some as they had been gathered in some part, they would and could have a very superficial understanding of anything civilized since before the revolution. And so this brought, by the way, Ukrainians essentially to detach themselves from the Poles, deserting towards the Dniester river into Czechoslovakia at that point. The Poles retreated with more valor, and actually the Polish retreat is very famous in the annals of military history because of the even in here it displayed this impressive combined armed capacities for the time being, right? This was a moment in which aviation was playing a dramatic role, right? Properly spotting the enemy positions, and ensuring a safe retreat. The armor of the Polish 3rd and 2nd Tank Companies performed valiantly rearguard duty while the rest of the army withdrew. They would literally stop under enemy fire. Consider at this point we're talking about armor. Armor could be taken out by automatic, and enough concentrated automatic weapon fire, right? So, and they would give time for the rest of the army to retreat safely. And in spite of this, the Poles were obliged to speed up the retreat, to abandon quite a considerable amount of material, including also many aircraft. Also, the Soviets in the process managed to rescue 5,000 communist prisoners of war at Zhytomyr alone. Nevertheless, the Polish army maintained control, cohesion, order, and not only managed to reach Poland safely, but also to avoid on multiple occasions complete encirclement. Right. So just imagine, by the way, what these conditions are. So in June and July 1920, we were talking about. Also, the war effort kept going on. We were talking before about the Soviets managed to arm en masse, at least just with rifles, large quantities of men. In July, the Bolsheviks managed for the first time to assemble their locally built airplanes, because up to that point they were essentially Western stuff. And however, in the entire year, the Russian factories could produce only 462 planes, which wasn't much considering the numbers altogether, and also the speed in which this was happening, by the way. And Poland was even less industrialized than Russia at this point. However, thanks to its more westernized culture, and so openness also to their capitalist allies, they managed to field more modern and reliable equipment than the communists. Poland bought a large quantity of arms, what remained, for example, of the Imperial German stockpiles left over after the war. Also, Britain and France sent new weapons. There is kind of a romantic detail here of the famous American soldier of fortune, Major Cedric Fauntleroy from Tennessee, and his a band of aviator adventurers, veterans of the war, etc., who essentially offered his services to Poland. And Pilsudski had doubts about this because initially the band wanted to be paid, but Fauntleroy, knowing of this, offered for him and his men to serve as volunteers, and this is how Pilsudski allowed them to become the 7th Kosciuszko Squadron. Kosciuszko being famously a hero of Polish independence of the 18th century. Also, it's famous also because of the American Revolution and so on. So the Soviets recognized manpower as just a traditional Russian strength point, right? So in July, the Bolsheviks extended conscription laws to include literally, 65% of all the Communist Party members to join the army. We're talking about the most different people, like railwaymen, just pure politician party members, defense workers, criminals. And there were also amnesties for deserters to join, which were present in large numbers considering the events of the Civil War. And so this provision convinced over 1 million soldiers to rejoin the army. Right, there was something properly revived in propaganda here about what had happened. After all, the Poles had invaded, right? So they were they're considered as essentially the force of capitalism wanting to enslave the great Russian nation, all these things, and so this triggered that sense of national interest that in part had played in the Civil War on the longer run, exactly because of these ethnic differences at some point. It's like the whites, right? They, at some point, even in Ukraine, they were being shot both by the Reds and both by Ukrainians. At the same time, say, okay, well, I will just go to the communists because at least, they are Russians. And, of course, it didn't really end well for many of them, but anyhow, so what Poland lacked instead at this point was probably the population, at least in comparison to what was taking form probably as a Soviet empire. And however, never underestimate courage, right, which is boundless as much as cowardice in humanity. And the fact that the Poles had been, of course, essentially a people which had really suffered oppression, right, and probably they had seen their country cancelled from the political map for more than a century, and Polish nationhood, language, culture, etc., lived in the interests of its people, of its elite, and they. This was their chance essentially to fight and die or otherwise to see their country cancel again, because this was frankly the plan that the Soviets had for them. And it's not that the West gave a damn about the Poles at all, right? If this was functional, right, for, you know, countering a German resurgence, or in fact stemming the same communist threat that was thing. But you know, a few people in the West, sadly enough, as today in many ways, really understand Central and Eastern European history and understand what it means really to be in the shoes of such peoples and what they endured historically. So as the Soviets were approaching Poland, in order with the objective of conquering it, the Poles raised new divisions. They reorganized. They displayed this sheer bravery for which literally non-military people with no previous war experience. We're talking about, you know, poets, priests, right? Which is a big deal here. You know, Polish Catholicism, also in this sense opposed to what was traditionally Russian Orthodoxy, but also in the most, let's say, in the darkest aspect, let's say, of every culture, in the Polish case, anti-Semitism, not less than the Russians or the Germans for that matter, but still was important here. I've inserted, for example, some propaganda manifestos we will show, essentially Polish. Of course, it was a thing here. You see Trotsky, like essentially a Jewish Satan kind of like thing, and the purpose was, you know, these are Polish manifestos written in, you see, in Cyrillic, for Ukrainians and for Russians in general, showing essentially the Jewish caricature of the devil and all these things, destroying the Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe, right? So they were trying to properly warn the fact that communism was harboring sort of Judaism, and so an anti-Christianism at the utmost level, right? This was part of the thing. And in many ways there were other times. Today, fortunately, it's not really like that. But it's important to stress that these things happen too. In any case, we're talking again about everybody, like old people. Everybody joined the army. The Poles reorganized their army. They organized, for example, a volunteer division composed of these most unlikely soldiers. And yet, this would prove to be a greatly spirited troop, right? They didn't have much discipline, but they were dramatically aggressive and enthusiastic in combat. So these forces, even if they are, you know, just mass, they can make, right? They are important in a broader economy of morale. Neither Poland or the Soviets at this point, as we've seen, could really sustain a protracted war, right? So this was evidenced by the fact that, I don't know, just the Soviet army alone consumed 1/4 of the grains of the whole country, of the whole, and so the soldiers were nicknamed Jedoki, that is, eaters, literally. And the Poles had similar problems, albeit, as we've seen, they had less populace. Also, they were more open to the West. For example, Churchill, among others, helped acquire shipments of grain abroad to send to Poland, at this time through Gdansk. In fact, the Bolsheviks would try to cut the supply lines with Warsaw in order to increase the Polish difficulties. And the World War, as you imagine, took a dramatic ideological meaning, because really this is one of the single most important military events in the history of Europe, of the world altogether in the 20th century, because literally between the Bolshevik army and Europe, there was nothing left but the Polish army, right? So the Battle of Warsaw acquires an incredible meaning for all the powers involved, and especially for the ones who were directly involved, given that they were the ones who recognized this more clearly from the ground, right? Up to a few years ago. I mean, I think this war has been popularized somewhat in recent times, but like in the West, it's not that we talked about it very much. Like most of these stories are okay, strange things that happen a bit eastwards, but these were essentially, a Bolshevik victory in this war would have essentially brought to enormous changes, unpredictable outcome, because literally the continent was exhausted, right? Whereas these red forces were still out there and dangerous. So the Poles were literally one of the most important bulwarks at that point that could be put against them in the first place. And of course they were motivated by the fight for independence, but also for contrasting, of course, the communist revolution. And so the atheistic ideology, the barbarity of communism in the first place, the process of the dehumanization of the masses, of a rigid ideologization, of complete brainwashing, subjugation under threat of literally of annihilation, and so instilling default paranoia and denial of reality in order to literally as the default mode of anybody who lived under the Bolshevik regime, in order to control them, because they literally would have had nothing else, right, to remain in the situations in which they were, the most appalling moral and material miseries in the history of mankind ever achieved, with the most despicable incompetence, evil. Frankly, it was evil. Was no other way to say it. The events, eventually, of the consolidation of the Soviet Union at this point in the following years would be, as you know, of just if it was just for collectivization alone, would cause one of the single greatest amount of killing in the history of mankind out of sheer incompetence. Like the abstract idea that communism is something that can't work, right? People starved to death in larger numbers than the Civil War as a direct consequence. There was not even need to kill them as enemies or anything. No, they were simply killed by themselves. And they it's horrifying. In any case, there was also a lot of strain put on within Poland, because Pilsudski was dramatically opposed by essentially also the same Polish right wing. And when he came back to Poland, he effectively enacted a coup to ensure the defense of Warsaw. It's very interesting to read in his memoirs how the thing went, because, by the way, Pilsudski, as a great leader and the author of this great success, was still essentially lacking a formal military education, and it was criticized for the way he managed. Even the same defense of Warsaw could be carried out in a much more, even let's say, more effective fashion. Mainly for logistical problems, but it's interesting. There were also many French observers of how properly the Polish frontier with Russia was organized, because aside from the Polish retreat here, there was still the Polish line, the Polish front that was invested by the Russians and had it was very long. It was like 1,200 kilometers. With a ridiculous front line and reserve ratios, like it would have been 2-1, a regular thing. The French observers found 5-1, and that's why fundamentally the territory controlled by the Poles could collapse entirely up to the Vistula, up to Warsaw at this point. So the situation was dramatic, and in his memoirs, Pilsudski admitted that it was essentially a gamble, because had Warsaw being lost, everything would have been lost anyway. So the only way to resist now, it was fundamentally to stand their ground, to do it. It doesn't matter how dramatic the situation was. And the Westerners really didn't show too much understanding of this situation. The Prime Minister Lloyd George of England, that technically supported Poland, as we've seen also with Churchill, who was operating in her favor, laconically commented that Pilsudski was just an ambitious fellow, like likely to get his head knocked off. The French, that were also historically, as you know, Polish allies, valued Pilsudski mainly in function, as we were saying before, as what was called by the French the cordon sanitaire. That is to say, this sanitary, meant literally from a moral point of view, bulwark, like first of all around Germany, because that was the main French interest, but also at that point against Bolshevik Russia. So all those states that now were forming right after the dissolution, especially the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc. But everything that stood literally between Russia and Western Europe at that point. So diplomacy also was used in quite interesting fashion. The Soviets, and if you think what is been happening, in these days, considering the months before, like it was all negotiation formally, right? So to show the world that everything was like the Russians were working that hard for solving the thing, instead they had the complete the obvious purpose of attacking. So the Soviets thought to entertain the Westerners by showing they were negotiating with the Poles without actually getting nowhere. And in fact, they were also engineering, like it was the case of the Soviet theorist Karl Radek, the excuses for example, not paying the World War I debts, right? Given the fact they had been invaded by Poland. Also, the Poles were described as Panskaya, that is to say, lordly Poland, by the Bolshevik pamphlets that circulated at that time. And still, at that point, the Bolshevik experiment was young, so also certain things properly were being understood only at that point. But still, there was a lot of hope that after World War I, still in these turbulent years, right? In Germany it would be essentially a civil war. In other countries too, even among the winners, the very tough things were happening. In Italy there was the also civil war against the communists. In other countries things were pretty strained, right? So the Bolsheviks hoped for a general revolution of the workers, right? And they were spreading messages in that sense in a mixed way, just politically. So they were looking at the enemies of Poland traditionally and saying, look, don't do this, don't do that, right? For example, well, to the Russians they said simply, do not sell bread to Poland, because that they take it to get strength to fight against Russia. To the Germans they said, do not pass through Poland, because think about Danzig, and do not unload ships destined to, but don't help. To the Austrians they said, do not make trains pass between Italy and Poland, right? You know that in the Italian and Polish national anthems, respectively, that there is the reference to the Austrian oppression. So, but all this Bolshevik propaganda actually didn't make Poland any serious harm, because the other countries really didn't give a damn about this, and so that was actually a theater. And there was even an attempt to trigger revolution within Poland itself. Of course, there were communists in Poland, and the Russians had established, like it happened for other nationalities, a Polish communist government in Russia, known as the Polrevcom. So this would be the Polish Revolutionary Committee. This occurred properly at that point on July the 23rd, 1920, and it was actually ridiculous because it was just basically a train where they had installed a printing press, and so these Polish communists just were on this train that traveled behind the Red Army while it was invading Poland, but aside making some publication of propaganda, didn't really attain, even in this case, more than much in Poland itself. And there was, however, some international interest for the situation because it was understood while the Red Army crossing into Poland that properly, things could get pretty serious at this point. So that the British Foreign Minister Lord Curzon proposed for an armistice, establishing what would remain for decades, known as, in fact, the Curzon Line, which was in turn nothing else than essentially the boundaries that had been set by the Congress in Vienna in 1815, which was something that the Poles didn't give a damn because several hundred square miles of historical Poland would have been simply left to the Soviets, according to this line. So, Curzon didn't really strike there, any chord. The Red Army continued its advance, and there was some preoccupation from the communist side, right? Because the situation wasn't simple at all from a logistical point of view. The Bolsheviks missed an opportunity there because they could stop, right? You managed to repel the invaders. No, they had to push through, essentially opening their army in two chunks that would stretch the front for hundreds of kilometers with difficulties to connect it and coordinate the two sides. This was the line of invasion the Russians had followed during the Polish uprising of 1831. So essentially, crossing the Vistula and Torun and descending south towards Warsaw unopposed. So also cutting the Warsaw communication with the sea, from which they received supply from the British, etc. And the south, the Soviet south, was actually weak. That point in the center was difficult to communicate, in part because they had to go through the Pripyat area. That it's called the Pripyat marshes, and it's actually not a marshy area. It's just there are many rivers and many woods, right? And so you can't just cross it that easily. You have preferably to split in different chunks. And this is essentially what the Poles benefited from, because the communists had had problems with communication. They hesitated a little bit to advance, and so every moment was gained by the Poles was at their advantage. And the Red Armies crossed the Curzon line in late July. They bridged the Neman River on July the 20th, and the book on August the 1st. At this point, any negotiation seems superfluous because, what the hell are you asking for if you invade a country? If the Soviets were about to conquer Poland by force, there was no need to talk even from the communist standpoint. As we were saying before, negotiations had served the purpose that the same Marx, historically in political theory, and in this case Lenin, intended, for distracting the capitalists long enough to ensure their defeat in a way. Instead, from the Polish side, it was literally a matter of supreme national sacrifice. It was defending their homeland from the invaders, and therefore there was no other, choice. It was the thing they had to do, or die in the fort, because that's what you're left with. So in the opening weeks of August, the Polish army had fundamentally abandoned all its positions in the east, and their forces were converging all on Warsaw for its defense. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks advanced on that city, as we have seen, both from the north and the south. In the meanwhile, however, and this is being criticized also a posteriori for the lack of concentrated effort in the Western Front, the Soviets were completing the destruction of the White Russians, counter-revolutionaries in Crimea. So, in part, actually, the troops that were eventually disengaged from that theater were being sent to Poland, but it was not done entirely. They could have waited for that matter. And so the Soviet superiority was obvious there. It's not discussed. Let's say it's just that, as always, in the larger the military engagement, the more the odds are balanced, because moral forces bring all stuff together. So the Poles were not dramatically outnumbered. Were like 100,000. The Bolsheviks were something more like 130,000, etc. And in different guys, as we've seen, many Poles were conscripts. So this doesn't actually take away the dramaticity of the situation, for that matter. But Soviet difficulties were also present, of course, in that strategic theater. And it was, however, understood that would have been a climatic battle in Warsaw that would have literally decided, at that point, the fate of Poland and the possibility of communism to spread from there in Germany and in the rest of Europe. And there is a debate about the numbers here. We skip because the Soviets were commanded by Tukhachevsky, who also wrote in his memoirs that he had much less troops than he was believed to have. Pilsudski said his own thing, but it's clear that, at least in numerical terms, the Bolshevik advantage was there. Right, and it was clear that for Poland that would have been a final stand. Like, if they had lost, they were doomed. There was no way to recover anything at that point. Warsaw was the heart of everything, of the government, of the national unity and everything. So it was really a dramatic situation. The Russians were alien to the territory. That was a disadvantage from their side. We have seen here how the Pripyat marshes played along, especially their communication lines, right? And there was a certain Soviet optimism, as the Red Army commanders hoped to take Warsaw by August the 12th already, but they basically made little progress with that goal. And that is quite important, because it already showed how Russian moral forces were kind of going down for their difficulties in communication, the staunch Polish resistance, and the Poles were galvanized. They were at the peak of their patriotic fervor at that point. It was something like, I don't know, the Warsaw radio reading the Genesis in Polish and in Latin, and all these things. And the truth is that, morally speaking, Poland managed to be strong at the moment when the Soviets were weak. Pilsudski was able to capitalize on this opportunity, and he decided on August the 16th to turn his troops and to attack. So this decision was really a gamble, really, and that's the thing that made the whole thing looking like a bagar or a bro. The same Pilsudski kind of admitted this. And for how close the Soviets were at that point, by the way, there was probably no other choice, at least in the way it had planned. You could criticize, but in this broader strategic situation, we will look at the Battle of Warsaw because it's very interesting. And if you visit the military museum, and there's plenty of interesting stuff you can like from the year. It was a beautiful vacation that I spent there. Hope to come back there soon. The Poles essentially managed to exploit the gaps between the Soviet armies and to split them further. Right. They also exploited the fact that the Russians were sending forward kind of certain forward troops because they were, of course, insecure about what they would find along the way, and so this first break in the front made the Soviets wary, and they realized that they were entering in a trap, in a sort of sense, so that after quite intense phases of fighting, the Red Army began to retreat, and this was a dramatic success. The Poles had 4,500 dead, as opposed to 10,000 to 25,000 dead from the communist side. Also, a very large number. We're talking roughly around 70,000 Soviets were captured, and roughly 30,000 of them would be interned in East Prussia. So we're talking about a total of, at least 100,000 casualties and losses. And however, the Soviet army still managed to retreat, right? Not to be properly surrounded, and managed to pull itself out. And so the scale of this defeat was so big that the same Soviets in the first days of the battle probably didn't really appreciate what had actually happened. Tukhachevsky was still considering counterattacks to secure his position, but basically the entire army was collapsing. So even the orders were just told to the wind. And the army began to simply retreat, right? So the Konarmia, in the meanwhile, had been sent to raid deep into Polish territory, and even when it encountered unexpected resistance, it was told to keep advancing forward. It was possible towards another direction if, of course, the threat was too big. But those were thought to be the Bolshevik antennas, let's say, to keep the Poles at bay in some way. But this would bring actually to the Konarmia itself being surrounded, finding itself surrounded in the area of Zamość. So in this instance, there is one of the most, it was not a particularly significant battle in the broader strategic balance, especially after this massive blow struck on the Soviets. But you've probably heard of the Battle of Komarov. Well, if you didn't, this is kind of famous in the annals of military history because it's probably the last true big cavalry battle in military history. There were other cavalry engagement all over, World War II, there were, I don't know, even in Afghanistan there were cavalry engagements. But this one was something really like properly the old style, right? What happened is that on August the 31st, the Konarmia had attempted to escape, but it found its route blocked by a ridge known as Hill 255, where the 8th and 9th Lancers of Brzezowski's Polish cavalry brigade were positioned, and these Polish units, heavily outnumbered against the whole freaking entire Konarmia, managed to keep the enemy mass at bay, charge after charge, right, holding back the Soviet cavalry army. And this gave time to the Polish nearby infantry divisions to coordinate their action and to attack the Bolshevik cavalry from the flanks, closing in. And the Konarmia commander Budyonny proved, himself maybe not to be willing to die for that ground, but at least he managed to pull the Konarmia out, right? So to avoid complete annihilation, right? But this was yet another blow to properly, even ideologically, to the prestige of the Red Army per se. So what factually happened is that a single Polish brigade fought the entire freaking Red cavalry army to a standstill. And the Polish cavalry is really, historically has a radically and violently and fanatically nationalistic and tradition of quality and honor and of excellence in that regard, so that we consider these things outdated in the age of machine guns. But actually in the Eastern Front it hadn't been quite the same. Even during World War II it was successful, right? Not against tanks. The story that Polish cavalry charged tanks is completely invented, never existed. But the Polish cavalry charges during World War II against the Germans were all largely, basically successful, almost all successful. And they were used because cavalry was still used, right, and was still effective by a certain degree. So after the Battle of Komarov, the Konarmia played essentially no relevant part in the war. So the Battle of Warsaw, the outskirts of Warsaw, lasted for 10 days. The Poles, as we've seen, captured over 60,000 prisoners, 231 guns, 1,023 machine guns. It was a disaster for the Soviets, who, by the way, fled into Germany, where they were internated. And the Soviets, at this point, had lost properly advantage in numbers. The Battle of Warsaw here acquires, again, one of the greatest miraculous characteristics in the annals of military history. The perfect storm, fundamentally, that proved this point and secured, by the way, the future, the very existence and independence of the Polish people. That, yes, was lost again to the Soviets and the Nazis later on, but that today, as you can see, proves that certain stocks do not die. And the battle also was just, again, the turning point of another strategic phase of the war, because basically the Poles launched again another invasion of Russia, or at least they began to run after the Russians again. And the Bolsheviks essentially passed from river to river, hoping to slow down the Polish advance. And in fact, they achieved a stalemate strategically along the Neman River. And at the town of Grodno, there, Tukhachevsky was able to say, recollect his army and to stem the Polish advance. And this confrontation brought to large-scale bayonet fighting, for example, between the opposing infantry. So that tells you properly the rate. You know that bayonet charging was, especially by, it's something rare in general, because it proves morale, right? When somebody fixes bayonets, it means because that they can give also. Normally the other side simply breaks before the charge even happens. Instead, at this point, they hated each other so much that they gave rise to these things. And this is important because in Eastern Europe, in the steppe, etc., bayonet charges were really quite rarer even than in other places, because there were very open spaces. There was a lot of cavalry, as we've seen. Those charges were displaying enough cold steel, but properly the possibility of in the spaces to even or the strategic necessity to attack in that fashion were not there, right? There you had to use, well, cavalry, artillery, machine guns. Famously enough, there were armored trains. At some point we'll make hopefully a video about what was really Russian Civil War warfare, because it's very beautiful to study, militarily speaking. And in any case, Tukhachevsky army failed to in this occasion and began to fall back again, right? And the Ukrainians, in the meanwhile, were regrouping in Czechoslovakia. They crossed the Dniester River on September the 15th, and they essentially anticipated the Poles in entering Ukraine. And by September the 27th, the Poles were marching on Minsk. At this point, the two sides were ready for a truce, at least, which occurred on October the 12th. Winter begins early in Central Eastern Europe, so as we've seen, the two countries were strained, and logistically that would have been impossible to go on, and there was probably no reason. That the Poles had proven really what they were made of. The Soviets had realized they had pushed too far, and so there were essentially peace discussions at Riga, so in neutral Latvia. And this brought to the division of Belarus, so that would be modern Belarus, and Ukraine between themselves. And the main point of contention, though, was the city of Vilnius, because this was an area that had been the Poles wanted for them, and formally in the negotiations, the Soviets handed it to Lithuania, because Lithuania was, Vilnius is traditionally the Lithuanian capital, is, in history, even before the modern state proper. But the Poles wanted that, and so Pilsudski made a route. Fundamentally, he told his army to fake a mutiny and to march on Vilnius, and so that's what happened. And so at that point, it would remain this would create problems to Poland, because Poland had been eager in all this. It had occupied areas, from the German lands, the Lithuanian lands. They wanted to expand in Ukraine. They had fought against the Russians, etc. So this would create problems in the post-World War I. In these years before. Before World War II. Let's put it better. To the Second Polish Republic, to the Polish state, because of course there were these ethnic issues, given that those lands were historically not really Polish, or at least even if they had been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the situation now in the 20th century was also under the profile of nation states and this sense of identities of belonging in broader international problems, namely what would emerge as the Soviet Union from just next door, that would complicate the thing rather much. Pilsudski considered Vilnius essential to Polish future in the north, So the as we were saying, Vilnius was taken by a ground and air attack on October the 9th by the Polish army. Russia and Poland signed the Treaty of Riga on October the 25th. The terms wouldn't allow for an independent Ukraine, which would become a Soviet republic. And however, Poland saw most of its historic territory recognized by the Soviets, and who also paid, in fact, a substantial monetary reparation to Poland. And this, let's say, would, as you know, historically wouldn't be the settlement of the matter, because the Soviets would keep hating the Poles. We all know what happened in 1939. And in general, these are stories, and maybe we will see on another occasion, but it's very important to realize how how relevant these events were, because literally just different events in the same Kiev offensive or the Soviet invasion of Warsaw could have resulted in a very different historical outcome, right, in this region. And who knows, whether it would have been better than how things went eventually for us to see now, which really makes you reflect on it. And I would like, by the way, to dedicate this video to my Polish audience for the remarkable support they are showing to Ukraine. The first ones to send weapons, also risking the convoys entering the same Ukraine to sustain Ukrainian resistance, also for the great support that they show to Ukrainian refugees that are flocking to Poland, that has completely opened its borders to them. So these are very difficult times for everybody, and we all have much at stake in this. So I hope that by making these videos, I can, even just if somebody has never heard of these things, if is curious, just want to listen, or maybe it's just a way to kill time without getting paranoid, for things that are going on. But I hope that you enjoyed this, and I wish you a great time.